While it's relatively common knowledge, at least in principle, that a battleship needs an awful lot of supplies to make it go, whether that be fuel so that it can actually physically go somewhere, shells and charges so it can shoot at things when it gets there, or food and other things to keep the crew going so that they can keep the ship going so that it can get to various places and shoot various things. Where exactly this all goes, and to a lesser extent how it gets there, is something that is not usually addressed in huge amounts of detail. Today, however, we're going to use an exemplar ship to try and illustrate how much of a battleship is actually taken up by various forms of supplies. Of course, a lot of things will be different on a ship-by-ship basis. Both within a class, there might be slightly different layouts of supplies and storerooms, depending on where the ship has been built, but also obviously between different ships, so different types of battleship, different classes in a nation or between nations will have their storerooms laid out in different ways. You've also got to factor in that earlier on, ships would store coal, which is stored very differently from the way you would store oil, and we're going to be looking at an oil-fired ship today. And even within the same ship, things might change over the course of a ship's lifetime as more systems are added, other systems are taken away, and potentially different types of supplies are switched out. In some cases, perhaps even the type of fuel is switched out. And before we start looking in detail, just a quick note about how these things get down into the various storage areas. You're looking at three primary systems. For liquids, it's almost always some kind of piping. So if something is being supplied externally via a hose, as you can see here with refueling, or via perhaps a water distillation plant, there'll be piping that will take that liquid to its relevant storage tank. For things that are more solid, you can broadly define this in one of two groups. Is the item, whether it be a single item or a pallet of items, too heavy for a reasonable man or a pair of men to move? If so, it will almost certainly be moved into position by some kind of hoist. Moving across deck might be done by a trolley, obviously, but getting it between decks will almost certainly be done in some form of hoist system, especially for things like shells. And there might even be dedicated hoists for that specific item, especially in the case of shells, but more general goods might just have a more general hoist system through hatches that might be permanently fixed into the ship, or it might be temporary in the ship with just hatches opened and it's set up for the purposes of resupply and then taken away again, because obviously these kinds of penetration through decks are potential weak spots. But the largest amount of supplies that aren't in a liquid state are going to be taken aboard and stored by hand, by manpower, partly because, well, on a battleship, manpower is plentiful and available, and partly because most of the hatches in the ship are designed for a single person to get through at a time, usually with a little bit of wiggle room if you're going to and from the main portions of the ship. And that makes it impractical to have any kind of mechanical loading system for most of that area, but a person can easily pick up a box and go to the place where the storeroom is. And our guest for today, in helping us understand where everything goes, is this ship, BB-64 USS Wisconsin. For the primary reason that when I was going through my various folders of ship's plans, this was the first one I came across that A, dated to, well, just after the Second World War period, but basically in period for the channel, and 2, was clear enough at high zoom that you could actually see and understand what was going on, because some of the others are understandable, but there's a lot of artifacting on those plans. So, with that being said, let's see where everything was stored aboard USS Wisconsin and what it was. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to start at the very bottom of the ship and work our way up to the last continuous deck of the ship, because that's essentially where pretty much all the storerooms are and where everything relevant is. Yes, in the superstructure there are a handful of small storerooms, but they're not really relevant to ship scale supplies and logistics. And yes, don't worry, we will be zooming in. We won't be looking at this large overall view, except on very rare occasions. So let's start off with fuel oil. This is something that will recur in almost every single one of these plans, but at the very, very lowest level, the inner bottom, there are two large primary fuel storage areas. One is astern, where the lowest portion of the hull becomes full width, because prior to that you've got what on the USS New Jersey is called the Holland Tunnel, part of the skegs between the two inner propellers. There's a huge amount of other liquid storage, mostly water, until you get to past the forward machinery spaces, and just after the ship's hull starts narrowing again as it heads towards the bow, and this entire area is just fuel oil storage all the way into the thinnest portion of the bow. And since this is the era when the ship is running on bunker fuel primarily, there are two small separate diesel fuel storage areas. The one aft is just ahead of the aft fuel oil storage, and the one at the forward part of the ship is just behind the fuel oil storage. And these, of course, are to hold the diesel fuel, which will power generators and other secondary machinery. Now, I mentioned earlier an awful lot of water storage, and here that is. Running mostly close to the center line is a series of tanks for reserve feed water. So this would be reserve water for use in the boilers rather than for drinking. And the reason for having this much water aboard, apart from the fact that all the liquid down here is obviously adding to the ship's stability, is of course the fact that boilers will be running at different capacities of water depending on what speed they're running at. A boiler that's running at absolute full power will need a lot more water for any given unit of time than a boiler that's running to keep the ship going at, let's say, 8 to 10 knots. So it's not a case of, oh, well, once the water is in the boiler and turbine system, that's it, we don't need to store any more. You do need more for when you're running at full power, but also you will have losses in any system, and so you'll need to top it up with these reserve feed water tanks. And then mostly outboard of the reserve feed water, which sits primarily directly under the machinery, but in three cases sharing that kind of mostly centerline space, are the fresh water tanks. And the water stored here will have numerous uses, of course, the most obvious being for people to drink and shower in. But even though there's quite a large amount of fresh water here, as anyone who's served in the Navy will know, especially back in those days when these ships were still in service, there is only a limited amount of water present per person per day, given how many people there are on the ship. So anything that increases the amount of fresh water you can store aboard, or increase the amount of fresh water you can generate as it's being used, will always be very, very popular with the crew. So that wraps up our look at the lowest level of USS Wisconsin, the inner bottom. There are 5 more levels to look at, but as you can see as we zoom out, the lowest level of the ship is both incredibly full of ship stores, and they're entirely liquid, because liquid is of course dense, and as I mentioned earlier, this will help with the ship's stability if they're down here, less so if they're up top. And in the case of the fuel at least, and the reserve feed water, it's relatively close to the machinery which needs it. We're now skipping past the third bottom, which is just void spaces, onto what, according to the plans, is called the hold. Now, firstly, as you can see as we're going past, hopefully you're guessing the colour scheme by now, we have more fuel storage. Now this is running down the sides of the ship, and if you look, you can see just inboard of all this fuel storage is a series of compartments labelled void. And that is because we've now encountered the first elements of the ship's torpedo defence system, which remember is going to be void, liquid, etc. layers. And what we're looking at here is the outer sections, the liquid-filled layers, and then the void sections, which, surprisingly, are empty. And that's also why you'll note pretty much all of the fuel compartments from now on, with the exception of a handful, are labelled as fuel oil and ballast, because as the fuel oil is drawn out, it would be replaced by ballast water for 2 reasons. Firstly, again, stability, because it's keeping heavy liquid loading low in the ship. You don't want the ship to ride up too high and potentially expose beneath its armour belt or change its trim adversely. But also, stability issues aside, you need that area full of liquid so as to preserve the torpedo defence system's nature. It's no good having a torpedo defense system that only really works in the few days just after you leave port and after you've been out at sea for a few weeks. It's now virtually useless because it's all void because you've used up all the fuel there. And the last time we'll see any major diesel storage, although it's not all that big, you can hopefully see just in the center of the picture and a little bit towards the bottom, there's a handful of small diesel day storage tanks here in the aftmost portion of the ship, just to the starboard side, sitting between the inner starboard and outer starboard propeller shafts. And up front here, we're going to encounter the first of several layers of storerooms, which are, at least on the German plans, rather unhelpfully just labelled as SD storerooms, which means supply department storerooms, which essentially means they can hold almost anything that's not food or something that's likely to go boom or burst into flames if it gets hit in the wrong way. So these will be dry stores, but stores that are not covered by storerooms elsewhere which have been specifically labelled. So if you've been in the Navy, and particularly obviously in this case the US Navy, you can chime in below and tell us what kind of magical things you can find in the supply department storerooms, because this is the kind of area where what exactly is stored here will not only vary quite considerably on a ship-by-ship basis, because the supply department officers aboard various ships might have very different ideas of what to use the various storerooms for, but it can also vary, obviously on a time basis, but also on a deployment-by-deployment basis. So not only will perhaps these forward storerooms down here in the hold be used for something very different in the 80s to what they would have been used for in the 40s, but potentially if they're in use for one type of store in 1945, by 1950, or perhaps by 1946, they might be used for something slightly different, depending on how everything is, well, stored according to whoever's in charge of said storing. And we also meet the first storerooms for things that could go boom. On this level, we are still well below the main magazines, so there's just a single small ordnance storeroom aft, but quite a few smaller ordnance storerooms forward as well. Again, to emphasize, these are not the 5-inch or 16-inch magazines, so this would be a variety of other ordnance stores. And then we meet the category you're probably going to become most familiar with through the rest of this tour, which is what I've termed miscellaneous. These are various storerooms which usually are specifically labelled, but are not necessarily singular, although sometimes they can be, but they're usually relatively specific. So they don't recur in and of themselves all over the ship, but they do need highlighting. So in this case, aft we have 2 bagged provisions storerooms, which obviously are for food that can just be stored en masse in bags and presumably do not need refrigeration, because there's no notes here about refrigerated store areas, although I know from touring USS New Jersey that these 2 areas were at one point or another converted into refrigerated areas as well. Bearing in mind we are quite deep in the ship, so this area is going to remain quite cool generally speaking. So the fact that at this point it doesn't seem to have any refrigeration is not necessarily indicative of the fact it's room temperature. It's still going to be fairly cool down here, but the temperature will fluctuate more than it would in a dedicated refrigeration chamber. And the other such room is here up front. This is the marine storeroom and landing equipment storeroom. So this gives you some idea of just how likely people thought landing parties off of an Iowa-class battleship were going to be. Because if you need this stuff in a hurry, you ain't getting in a hurry. We're very, very deep in the ship, and honestly, anything that could charitably be described as landing equipment is not going to be able to be lifted through those tiny little single-man ladder hatchways you can see illustrated there. It's going to have to be taken out of this room along the ship to an area where there's a somewhat more substantial access way and taken up multiple decks. So the storeroom exists, but it's not anticipated it's going to be used all that much. And so now, likewise, by combining all those together, we can see how much storeroom there actually is in the hold. And surprisingly enough, for something called a hold, which is of course something of a carryover from previous ships, especially merchant ships, there isn't actually all that much storage in the hold. There's primarily the fuel oil, which, as we've discussed, is also part of the torpedo defense, but the vast majority of this area of the vessel is taken up by the boiler rooms and engine rooms in the center there. We're now up onto the third platform deck, and you can see that once again we have fuel storage areas running either side of the ship, forming once again part of the ship's anti-torpedo defense system, as well as keeping the ship going. Of course, this being an American ship, there's a huge amount of fuel on board, so we're going to see these tanks again for the next couple of decks at least. Although it should be noted that the third platform deck is also shown here, as the second platform deck intrudes on the bow if you stay at complete level. Then above that small area for bag provisions we saw one level down, we now have a large storage area for cased and bagged provisions. So these are the provision storerooms aft. You can also see just behind them there's a whole load of supporting structure for storerooms which are on the next level above us, but they are not in and of themselves storerooms just yet. So now we head past all the machinery spaces quite nice and rapidly, because there's nothing much of interest here for the SD storerooms, to the forward area of the ship. So here on the second platform area, you can see there's a series of fairly standard SD storerooms, which you can see widening out as the ship's torpedo defense system comes to an end at the bow. Then there's the chain locker causing a little break, and then you have the paints and oils storeroom, which is just ahead of that. And then just moving up on the plans, we see on the third platform, there's fairly standard supply department storerooms. And then we move on to the ordnance storerooms. Right aft, you've got the rather obvious circular section, which is the bottom bit of the barbette for turret 3. That's the aft turret. But as you can see, there's considerably more boom in this area than just in the barbette itself. You've got the 16-inch powder magazines, which will obviously feed through the hatches in and scuttles into the barbette itself. You've also got a small arms magazine up there on the top left, and two 40mm ammunition magazines. So for those of you wondering where the Bofors 40mm ammunition is stored, here's where some of it is stored. You've got a smaller one up there on the top left next to the small arms magazine, and you've got a much larger one there at the bottom left. So for reference, the top of the picture corresponds to the port side of the ship, the bottom of the picture corresponds to the starboard side of the ship. And then we dash quickly past the machinery spaces again, and we find a fairly similar setup with the forward section of the ship. So we've got obviously two barbettes, we've got turrets 1 and 2, the forwardmost and the super firing. We've got 16-inch powder magazines, pretty much as per the aft section, although the powder magazines, they're a little bit larger here because obviously they're supplying two separate turrets. And we have a 40mm magazine right forward. That's on the right-hand side of the red section here. As we already established, the second platform forward is pretty much just full of supply department storerooms and some paint. So over on the third platform, there's a small ordnance storeroom, as you can see, sandwiched between other supply department storerooms. And as far as miscellaneous goes on this level, because of the rather large amount of ammunition that's being stored here, as well as the supply department stores, the only other thing that's particularly of note is the electrical storeroom, which you can see just here on the port side forward of turret 1. And although I haven't coloured them in because they're not strictly crew level storage areas, i.e. things that might be accessible or at least useful to most of the crew, just after the supply department storeroom, there's a variety of small storerooms for the high-ranking officers. So there's a captain's storeroom, an admiral's storeroom, wardroom storeroom, and a warrant officer's storeroom. So that gives us an overview of what's here on the second and third platform levels. Mostly on this level, ammunition storage, ordnance, with a fair amount of supply department storerooms and a small amount of technically personal, although officer assigned rooms, the electrical storeroom, and of course lots and lots of fuel. And now we're on the first platform level. We once again have a whole series of fuel and ballast tanks running down the port and starboard sides of the ship, starting aft just past the barbette of the third turret and continuing forward to well past the barbette of first turret, or turret 1, to again enhance torpedo protection, because we still have those void spaces you can see running right behind it. And so going on to our supply department storerooms, you can see just aft there are two, one right aft and then one on the port side. Now I'm using green obviously to denote supply department storerooms, and these are just SD rooms. You can see there's a ton of other storerooms here, but we're going to look at those in a minute under miscellaneous because they are specifically labelled. And that's pretty much it for the supply department along most of the ship, except for right up in the bow. So quickly skipping over to there, and you can see we have more supply department storerooms occupying pretty much the entirety of the bow. Again, with that dog tooth going on where you have the torpedo defense system ending, and a continuation of the paints and oils storeroom, which is the second but one compartment in terms of storerooms themselves, as opposed to the peak tank, which is the very, very bow of the ship. And now on to ordnance and other things that burn. Speaking of things that burn, the gasoline tanks right aft. These are obviously in place for the scouting aircraft that the Iowa class carried in the 1940s and early 1950s. In this case, as you can see, there are 4 large gasoline tanks. I doubt they're still there in the ships as they are as museum ships nowadays. Granted, they did operate helicopters and then later drones later on in their service life, but the amount of gasoline stored here compared to the other uses that the fantail of the ship would have later in life makes me think that most of these would have been removed. Of course, if you happen to work at one of the Iowa class and you happen to know whether your gasoline tanks are around here on your first platform deck, do let us know in the comments below. And then coming forward slightly, we have the area around the barbette of turret 3. So we've still got the turret itself because there's projectile stowage, as you can see in the middle. We still have the powder magazines. For those of you who have been down inside the powder magazines of an Iowa class, or you've seen one of my videos touring them, you'll note these are almost cathedral-like spaces as far as battleships go. But you've also got, as you can see there at the starboard side, or bottom left in this picture, smaller rooms for detonator fuses, a small black powder magazine, a rather wonderfully labelled explosives and grenades, presumably mostly for the Marine detachment, a general purpose ordnance storeroom going further up or to the port side, and then on the top left of the section, or back port side if you're on the ship itself, another 40mm magazine. Then you can see there's a little section which I haven't coloured in because this is labelled landing force gear locker. So although this probably would include some form of explosive, it's a bit of a more generalized storage area. And then skipping past the engineering spaces again, we come across the forward magazine area. Now, this has quite a few interesting features. You'll notice first what looks like a big chunk taken out of the bottom left of the picture, so the starboard and center section. And that's because there is a pair of plotting stations. You can see the main battery plotting station and secondary battery plotting station. There is also another main battery plotting station elsewhere. So the one on the starboard side, on just a little bit below the center line on the picture, that is for the 16-inch guns. The secondary battery is, of course, for the 5-inch guns. And this is also the location, at least in the late 40s, for the Wisconsin's Combat Information Center, or CIC, which is there at the bottom left of the picture, starboard aft, if you're actually physically on the ship. To the port side, behind turret 2, you have an extension of the 16-inch powder magazine and another 40mm ammunition magazine. And as you can see, this theme continues as you go forward, more and more of the 16-inch powder magazine generally. There's 16-inch projectile stowage in the barbettes themselves, and right up forward, just to the right-hand side, if you're looking at the picture of turret 1's barbette, there's a tiny little inscription which says 20mm ammunition. So at this point, this is just post-World War II, the ship still has some 20mm Oerlikons aboard, and that's where their ammunition is stored. You can see again to the top right of the picture, so port side forward if you're on the ship, there's magazine cooling unit, so that's not actually a storeroom, that's an active part of the ship's machinery. The other thing that you'll notice here is the weird little indent in the powder magazine between turret 1 and turret 2. Now, if you've watched the Battleship New Jersey's videos done by Ryan Samansky and Libby aboard, well, shockingly, Battleship New Jersey, you'll notice one of the things that Ryan has spoken about is how the area around the forwardmost barbette is actually very cramped, and they had to make some design changes on the Iowas to fit that forward triple 16-inch 50 turret. And you can see exactly that here, because if you look abreast turret 2, you've still got the liquid and void spaces of the torpedo defense system, and then you have the 16-inch powder mags. And then you can see the line that should run if you ran those spaces at standard width further forward, but you can see that would intersect with and cut through the barbette. So what they've done between turret 1 and turret 2 is widen the interior spaces, thus narrowing that last section of void spaces, so void A34 at the top, void A35 at the bottom, and then the subsequent voids going forward, so A26 and A18 on the top or port side, A29, A21 on the bottom or starboard side, they are visibly and substantially narrower than the ones behind them. So that means that the torpedo defense system around this part of the Iowas is ever so slightly weaker than it really should be. As you can see, you've still got the full fuel width sections, and the first void sections are maintaining their continuous width, but that last void section is narrow and getting narrower, just enough to allow the void spaces to go past turret 1 instead of cutting into it. And that leads us off to the wonderful world of miscellaneous, i.e. the labelled unique storerooms. So you can see here aft, we have clothing and small stores in bulk on the bottom left of the picture, starboard aft. We have more clothing and small stores in bulk on the port side, and that storeroom is a little bit smaller than the one on the starboard side, because behind it and on the port side is a standard SD storeroom, a supply department storeroom, which we looked at earlier. There's a tiny little engineering stores just forward, and that little landing force gear locker, which is otherwise sat in the middle of a bunch of explosive in the ordnance section, just forward. And then if we come forward, going past the magazines, the machinery spaces, and then the magazines again, we come across a pair of compartments on the port side labelled Ship's Service Stores Storeroom, and on the starboard side, Ship's Store Storeroom, both of which seem a little bit redundant, but one of them has the word service in it, so I suppose there is a few mild differences. Now, you might be thinking, hang on a minute, I'm sure I spotted some more rooms aft there that look like they store things, but you didn't highlight any of them. Well, that's correct, because we're going to look at them now. On the previous decks, we saw there were some storage areas for bagged and canned stored goods, but here, in particular on first platform, is where we find the majority of the labelled storage area for food, particularly at the time, although as I said it has been extended since then, the refrigerated sections. So we've got provision storerooms for bagged provisions aft, the same kind of thing as we saw a couple of decks further down, as well as a storage room for cased provisions. Then there's the ice machine room for cooling things. And then we get into the refrigerated bit. So there's multiple meat rooms, as you can see there. Each of those is supposed to be kept at 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Ahead of them are fruit and vegetable rooms, which are supposed to be kept at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. There's even a specific storage area for butter and eggs, roughly in the middle of all of it, which is supposed to be kept at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and a thawing room, which is just to the aft of the butter and eggs room, which is supposed to be kept at a heady 40 degrees Fahrenheit, same as the fruit and vegetables. So that's where you take the meat to in order to initially defrost it before moving it over to the galley for preparation for consumption. So although it's all a little bit broken up, you can see, especially here over on first platform, that a huge amount of the ship's capacity is taken up in various forms of stores, everything from food to ammunition and paint and pretty much anything else you can think of. In fact, on the first platform level, pretty much the only major compartments that aren't involved in storing something or other are the steering gear rooms right aft And then, of course, the machinery spaces, which dominate the center section, and those plotting stations and combat information center rooms just behind Turret 2's barbette. And now we're up to third deck, and you'll be glad to know this is the last of the decks where you have fuel tanks running down either side. So if you don't want to see endless processions of long grey boxes, well, this is the last time you're going to have to do that in isolation. And even the supply department is finding itself a little bit hard done by, because by this level, there's a small supply department storeroom right aft, as you can see here, and then heading all the way forward, either side of some of the crew quarters, there's a couple of small supply department storerooms, and then right up at the bow, there's a couple more storerooms. Now, these are pretty standard, except for the fact they get very, very narrow and very small very quickly, except for two very small lockers that are part of this section, which you may or may not be able to see depending on the size of your screen. But on the left-hand side of the bow store area is a small compartment, just a little bit over to port, labelled alcohol storage. So yes, US ships still do carry alcohol, presumably purely of the medicinal type, and it's right up here in the bow. And then pretty much in the middle of that bow storage section, but with the access, by the looks of it, coming from the aftmost of the two larger areas, is the rather wonderfully named Supply Department Acid Locker. I will leave it to others to describe what the acids stored aboard are used for. Spoiler alert, it's not quite as exciting as you might think. But on a more exciting note, over to the things that burn and boom. We have an ordnance storeroom and aviation storeroom right aft. But then moving forward, of course, there's Turret 3's barbette, but you'll notice there's two small lockers just below, or to the starboard side. The one right aft, right up next to the cofferdam, is labelled Detonator Locker, and the other one is the 16-inch Powder Bag Locker, right in the middle of some of the crew quarters. I'm sure that was very comforting for whoever was sleeping there. And just forward of that again, so heading right up to behind the machinery space, is yet another 40mm magazine. And now for once we're not skipping over the machinery spaces, because in between the upper sections of each boiler are the 5-inch powder magazines, which rather sensibly have been stored as close to possible on the centre line. You can see their Broadway running down between them. And outboard of each of them is the 5-inch projectile storage area and handling room. So projectiles, which are somewhat more inert, being outside of the powder magazines, if you're going to have them on the same level, is a good idea. There's also a couple more 40mm ammunition magazines adjacent to the two forwardmost 5-inch powder magazines, and you can probably also see some of the diagrams there for the hoists heading up to the various 5-inch 38 twin mountings. And then we move forward again to, unsurprisingly, Turret 1 and Turret 2's barbettes. As you can see, 16-inch projectile storage, and yet another small 40mm ammunition magazine right up there near the bow. And then we have the miscellaneous stuff, and there's a lot of that on this level. There's clothing and small stores issue next to a print shop store just opposite from an athletic gear locker right aft, followed by a mixture of electronics repair parts storage areas and several repair lockers for damage control. Then multiple engineering storerooms, shockingly, either side of each of the boilers except for boiler number 6, which has a boiler workshop next to it. A couple more electronics repair parts stores in void spaces, and yet another repair locker. And then as we get right up to the front, you'll see again on the starboard side, some of the void spaces have been converted. So most of the void spaces on the right-hand side on the inner section are now medication stores or medicinal stores. One of them is navigation stores. Just inboard of that is radar equipment storage. And then clustered around the forward part of Turret 1's barbette, there's a battle dressing storeroom, a rather larger medicinal stores room, and on the port side, just to the top right of the picture, the rather entertainingly named Chemical Warfare Materials Stowage. which is almost certainly going to be all about gas masks and so forth, not about mustard gas and such like. And then coming all the way forward, we have the main issue room, which is a kind of general purpose room and is actually where a lot of stuff that had just been loaded onto the ship would go initially before being sorted elsewhere. And just forward of that is a nice big room, and if you've ever wondered where all those big canvas awnings that ships use while they're at sea, to cover the quarterdeck or whatever to provide shelter, this is where they're all stored, in the canvas awning room. So once again on the zoom out - pull out, you can see that not quite as packed as the deck immediately below it, but almost entirely dominated by the ordnance in terms of amount of space left over for storage. Primarily, of course, not just the barbettes, but that rather large space amidships taken up by the various 5-inch rooms. What you might be able to tell from a general glance is that actually on this deck, the single largest use of floor space aside from machinery rooms is actually crew accommodation, all those little rectangles denoting where there are stacks of bunks. And onto the last deck we're going to be looking at in this video, second deck. You'll be happy to know there's not a huge amount here because, again, it's mostly crew quarters and mess decking, but right aft there's another 40mm magazine and handling area. Then on the port side, just forward of turret 3, there's a very small master-at-arms storage locker-room, which obviously will contain some form of firearms and other ammunition. And then coming forward again, you'll notice I haven't highlighted turret 3 because at this point it's just hoists. However, I have highlighted turret 2's barbette because we still have projectile storage there. Similarly, turret 1 is now basically just hoisting. But immediately after turret 2, there is an ordnance storeroom and then an ordnance stores and issue room. And just to the port side, or top on the picture, of turret 1 is the Marines storeroom, which again is likely to contain at least small arms ammunition. And then over to the miscellaneous. So right aft on the port and starboard side, we have Chief Petty Officers storerooms, then Ship's Service Store on the port side and a ship's store on the starboard side, both adjacent to scullery areas. Then coming a bit forward, there's a plethora of little rooms. So on the starboard side, on the bottom, we've got a pipe and bar stowage area. And on the port side, so this is either side of turret 3's barbette, on the port side there's the ship's store and comm office, next to a provision room, next to a commissary office. Then, forward of turret 3, on the port side, there's a small ship's store, and on the starboard side, there's a bread room and bakery storeroom. And then, right forward near the centre line, there is an engineer's tool issue room and storeroom. You'll note I've generally left workshops and issue rooms off of the list, unless they're specifically noted to also be storerooms. And then right up at the bow, we have more repair lockers, for damage control obviously, and then right up front, we have the bosun stores, tackle, running gear, etc. room, the paint mixing room, and between the paint mixing room and that bosun's stores room, which are the two large rooms in the bow, we have a gear locker. And the two absolute foremost compartments, which are actually so small they have to have their labels elsewhere with arrows pointing in. We have paravane spares, in case the ship's paravanes take any damage, like say they catch a mine. And finally, right at the very front, a sand locker. So not a huge amount on this deck, really. And that's really for two primary reasons. Firstly, even more so than on the previous deck, a huge amount of this deck is taken up with accommodation. All those little rectangles you can see labelled either 3 or 4, indicating how many bunks there are occupying that particular height space. And of course, aft you've got the mess areas and, well, the cooking areas to supply the mess. And even the turrets at this point are mostly hoists, with the exception of turret 2. Plus, we're well above the armour deck at this stage, so you really just want to keep this area as clear of almost anything that could be potentially destroyed and impair the ship's fighting capability either immediately or shortly thereafter as possible. And that concludes our look at the permanent large storage areas aboard an Iowa-class battleship, which, at least by theme, should also give you an idea of where everything is stored aboard most other warships of a similar type, i.e. steam and steel warships. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, exact locations are going to vary, but the general principle of, at least when it's liquid, fuel being kept as low down as possible, water always being kept down as low as possible, and then as you progress up you have your various ammunition and food stores, etc., graduating towards less and less important and or more heavily armoured things as you transcend above the torpedo defence system, if there is one, the armour belt system, if there is one, and the armoured deck system, which there almost always will be one of, with modifications, of course, as for size, nation, and time period. So thanks for making it this far, if indeed you have, and we'll just round out with a nice quick slideshow showing all of the decks that we've looked at in this video in quick order of ascension, so you can get an idea of how quickly everything changes. And if you want copies of any of the slides that you've seen today, with all the various colours put in, layers, etc., then just message me on Discord or send me an email and I'll happily send you over whichever ones you happen to want. So thanks very much for watching, and see you again in another video. Now you know where everything is stored.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.